This is the beginning of a saga that challenges everything we understand about the resilience of the human spirit. It is a story of a man who was not just a victim of a crime, but a victim of a system designed to swallow people whole and leave no trace behind. Solomon Northup's life wasn't just a struggle for survival, it was a battle against the very concept of erasure. In 1853, a man emerged from the steam and shadows of a Louisiana plantation carrying only a letter and a memory. 12 years prior, he had been a respected citizen of the North, a musician, a husband, and a father. Then, in the blink of an eye in the nation's capital, he was gone. He didn't just survive the brutal cotton fields where the average life expectancy was a mere 7 years. He orchestrated a return that historians still study today as a masterpiece of calculated risk and impossible timing. But what makes this case truly haunting? It isn't just the physical endurance, it's the psychological war. Solomon Northup had to convince a world built on the denial of his humanity that he had never stopped being the man he was. He had to navigate a labyrinth of legal barriers and geographical distance, relying on a stranger's bravery and a letter that should have been intercepted. Before we dive into the chilling details of the trap that was set for him, I have a question for you to consider. If you were suddenly stripped of your identity and every document proving who you are was destroyed, what is the one memory or skill you would hold on to keep from losing your mind? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's go back to where it all began. In a place where Solomon believed he was completely safe, unaware that shadows were already closing in. Saratoga Springs, New York, in the spring of 1841, was the jewel of the American Northeast. Nestled near the Adirondack Mountains, the town was a playground for the elite, famous for its mineral springs that allegedly possessed healing powers. The streets were lined with grand hotels like the United States Hotel and Congress Hall, buildings of such architectural splendor they rivaled the finest palaces of Europe. In the summer, the town hummed with the sounds of prosperity, the clatter of carriage wheels, the rustle of silk dresses, and the constant, elegant strain of orchestral music. For a man like Solomon Northup, this was a land of opportunity. At 33, he was a master of the violin, a man whose hands held the power to command a room and whose mind was sharpened by a rare education. He wasn't just a laborer, he was an artist who moved through white society with a level of autonomy that was exceptionally rare for a black man in that era. Solomon's status as a free man wasn't just a social reality, it was a legal fact. Born in July 1808, he was the son of Mintus Northup, a man who had been emancipated by his master's will decades earlier. This meant Solomon was born into freedom, a birthright he never took for granted. His father had taught him to read and write, skills that functioned as both a tool and a shield. He understood the law, the power of documentation, and the importance of a sterling reputation. By 1841, he had built a stable, happy life with his wife, Anne Hampton, and their 3 children, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo. They lived in a house Solomon owned outright, a monument to his hard work. He was a man known to the local sheriff, the judges, and the merchants. His free papers were kept safe, but his real protection, he believed, was the community that knew his name and respected his talent. In late March 1841, as the winter frost began to yield to the first signs of spring, 2 men entered Solomon's life who would change the course of history. They introduced themselves as Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. They were well-dressed, charismatic, and spoke with the smooth confidence of successful businessmen. They claimed to be part of a traveling circus troupe heading south toward the capital, and they needed a musician. The offer was almost too good to be true. $1 a day, a high wage for the time, plus all expenses paid. The trip would only last a few weeks. He would be back in Saratoga before the busy summer season even started. Solomon was a prudent man, but the timing was perfect. Anne was away on a cooking contract, and the extra money would provide a significant boost for his family. He checked their references, felt their silver, and saw no reason to doubt their word. The journey began with the optimism of a professional tour. They traveled through Albany and New York City, where Solomon's violin was met with applause in various taverns and halls. Brown and Hamilton were generous companions, paying him promptly and treating him with a level of respect that put any lingering doubts to rest. But as they boarded the steamboat for Washington, D.C., the atmosphere began to shift in ways Solomon couldn't quite name. Washington was a city of contradictions, the seat of American democracy, and the heart of the domestic slave trade. Here, the Capitol dome rose over a city where slave pens were as common as hotels. Solomon carried his free papers, confident that the law of the land would protect him in the nation's capital. He had no way of knowing that he was being led into a jurisdiction where his voice carried no weight and his papers could be vanished in an instant. On the night of March 24th, 1841, the trap finally snapped shut. After a successful series of performances, Brown and Hamilton invited Solomon to a celebratory dinner at a local tavern. The mood was jovial, the wine flowed freely, and the conversation was full of talk about the future. But midway through the meal, a strange sensation washed over Solomon, a sudden, oppressive heat, followed by a dizziness that made the room spin. He excused himself for fresh air, but his legs felt like lead. He remembered stumbling, feeling supportive hands under his arms, and then a heavy, suffocating darkness. When he finally regained consciousness, the world of music and freedom was gone. He woke up in the damp, cold shadows of a stone cell, the rhythmic clink of iron chains replacing the melody of his violin. He was in the William slave pen, less than a mile from the White House, and his life as Solomon Northup had been officially deleted. The cold, damp floor of the cell was the first thing Solomon felt, a stark, unforgiving reality that shattered the lingering haze of the drugs. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through a small, barred window high above, the sound of his own breathing was interrupted by a rhythmic, metallic clink. He tried to reach for his head, which throbbed with a rhythmic, pulsing agony, only to find his wrists bound by heavy iron shackles. His ankles were similarly encumbered. This was not the plush hotel room in Washington he had fallen asleep in. This was a tomb for the living. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water, old straw, and the unwashed desperation of those who had occupied this space before him. Solomon called out, his voice raspy and thin, demanding to know where he was and who had done this to him. But the only response was the echo of his own terror bouncing off the stone walls. He was in the heart of the nation's capital, yet he had never been further from the protection of its laws. The realization began to dawn on him with sickening clarity. The two men, the circus, the promised wages, it was all an elaborate stage play designed to lead a free man into the jaws of a machine that traded in human flesh. The heavy wooden door groaned on its hinges, and a man stepped into the cell whose presence seemed to suck the remaining warmth from the room. This was James Birch, a notorious slave trader who operated with the efficiency of a bookkeeper and the soul of a predator. Solomon, still believing in the power of truth, immediately protested. He spoke of his home in Saratoga Springs, his wife Anne, his 3 children, and the legal documents that proved his status as a freeborn citizen of New York. He expected a mistake to be acknowledged, an apology to be offered. Instead, Birch's face remained a mask of cold indifference. He informed Solomon that his name was not Solomon Northup, but Platt, a runaway slave from Georgia. When Solomon persisted, shouting his true identity with the fervor of a man clinging to a cliffside, Birch's indifference turned to a calculated systemic violence. He produced a wooden paddle and a whip, and what followed was a brutal education in the new reality of Solomon's existence. Every time Solomon claimed his freedom, the paddle fell. The pain was transcendental, a searing white light that threatened to extinguish his consciousness, yet Birch continued until Solomon was silenced by sheer physical collapse. This was the beginning of the erasure, the process by which a man's history, dignity, and name are systematically stripped away to make room for a piece of property. Birch wasn't just beating Solomon to cause pain, he was beating him to break the connection between his mind and his identity. In the eyes of the domestic slave trade, a slave with a past was a liability, but a slave with a claim was a threat. Solomon realized with a horror that surpassed the physical pain that his free papers were gone. Brown and Hamilton had not just stolen his body, they had stolen his proof of existence. Without those papers, in a city where the testimony of a black man was legally void against the word of a white man, Solomon Northup had effectively ceased to exist. He was now Platt, a blank slate upon which the masters of the South could write whatever destiny they chose. Imagine the psychological weight of being beaten until you admit to a name that isn't yours. How long do you think you could resist before your spirit broke, or would you play the part immediately just to stay alive? Let's discuss the survival instinct in the comments below. After 2 weeks of confinement in the shadow of the Capitol, Solomon and a group of other captives were marched through the streets of Washington under the cover of a gray, indifferent dawn. They were chained together in a coffle, a human train of misery, and moved toward the docks to begin the journey to Richmond, Virginia. From there they were loaded onto the Orleans, a ship destined for the great slave market of the South, New Orleans. The voyage was a descent into a specific kind of hell. The hold of the ship was a cramped, sweltering oven where men and women were packed like cordwood. The movement of the sea was a constant, nauseating reminder of their powerlessness as they were carried further and further away from the north and the life they knew. Solomon watched as some of his fellow captives succumbed to despair, their eyes turning hollow as they realized the sun would never again rise on their freedom. Smallpox broke out on the ship, adding the specter of a slow, agonizing death to the already unbearable conditions. Solomon himself barely survived the fever, his body weakened, but his mind remains focused on one singular, desperate goal. He had to stay alive long enough to find a way back. When the Orleans finally docked in New Orleans in late April 1841, the sensory assault was overwhelming. The city was a sprawling, humid metropolis of commerce, where the smell of jasmine and rotting fruit mingled with the scent of the sea. Solomon was taken to the slave pen of Theophilus Freeman, a man who viewed his stock with the discerning eye of a jeweler. Here the captives were groomed for the auction block. They were given clean clothes, their skin was rubbed with oil to make them appear healthy and robust, and they were instructed to stand tall and look smart. It was a grotesque masquerade of health designed to hide the scars and the sickness of the journey. Freeman was a master of the hard sell, showcasing Solomon's strength and his skills as a musician to potential buyers. Solomon stood on the block, a man who had played for judges and governors, now being poked and prodded by men who discussed his muscles and his teeth as if he were a horse. The humiliation was a different kind of lash, one that cut deeper than any whip, as he realized that to these men, his humanity was merely a factor in his utility. The auction block was a place of fractured families and shattered souls. Solomon watched in silent agony as a woman named Eliza was separated from her children, her screams of grief ignored by the men who saw her only as a breeder, and her children as separate units of profit. The indifference of the buyers was the most chilling aspect of the market, the way they could conduct the business of destroying a family while discussing the price of cotton or the quality of the weather. Finally, a man stepped forward who would decide the next chapter of Solomon's life. William Ford was a Baptist preacher and a planter from the Bayou Boeuf region of central Louisiana. He looked at Solomon, or rather at Platt, and saw a valuable investment. He paid $1,000 for Solomon, a sum that in 1841 could have purchased a small farm in the north. With a stroke of a pen and the exchange of coin, the violinist from Saratoga Springs was officially property. He was loaded onto a wagon and began the long journey into the interior of Louisiana, heading toward a landscape of cypress swamps and pine forests where the law of the master was the only law that existed. As the wagon rattled away from the bustle of New Orleans and deeper into the wilderness of the Red River Valley, Solomon looked back at the receding skyline of the city. He was entering a world that was geographically and socially isolated, a labyrinth of water and wood from which few ever returned. The heat of the Louisiana summer began to settle over him like a heavy, wet blanket, a physical manifestation of the oppression that would define the next 12 years. William Ford, his new master, appeared to be a man of some conscience, a man who treated his servants with a measure of kindness that was rare in the Deep South. But Solomon was not deceived by the relative comfort of Ford's plantation. He knew that even a kind master was still a jailer, and that the system Ford represented was fundamentally built on the theft of human life. As the pine trees closed in around the wagon, Solomon whispered his own name to himself, a silent prayer against the erasure that had already taken so much. He was Platt to the world, but in the secret chambers of his heart, he was still Solomon Northup, and he was determined that the world would one day remember that name again. The transition into the interior of Louisiana felt like entering a different dimension. The landscape of Bayou Boeuf was a dense, suffocating tapestry of ancient cypress trees draped in ghostly Spanish moss, where the humidity felt like a physical weight against the lungs. Solomon's first master in this wilderness, William Ford, was a man of startling contradictions. A Baptist preacher who genuinely believed he was a good master, Ford treated his slaves with a paternalistic kindness that made the reality of their bondage even more surreal. Solomon, ever the strategist, recognized that Ford was a man of intellect who valued efficiency. To survive, Solomon leaned into his natural talents. He designed a system for transporting lumber across the winding waterways that saved Ford significant time and money. For a brief moment it seemed Solomon had found a niche where his humanity might be at least partially acknowledged. But this relative peace was a fragile illusion. In the Deep South, a slave's life was tied to the master's bank account, and when Ford's finances crumbled, Solomon was sold to settle a debt. The shift from the kindly Ford to a man named John Tibeats was like falling from a ledge into a pit of thorns. Tibeats was a small-minded, insecure carpenter who viewed Solomon's intelligence not as an asset, but as an insult. Tibeats was a man who lived in a state of perpetual irritation, and he focused his bile on Platt. The tension between them reached a breaking point over something as trivial as the size of a nail. Tibeats, in a fit of pique, attempted to whip Solomon for a perceived error in construction. But something in Solomon snapped. The years of suppressed dignity boiled over, and he fought back. He wrestled the whip from Tibeats and gave the man a taste of his own medicine. It was a moment of profound triumph, followed immediately by the cold realization of his certain death. In Louisiana, for a slave to strike a white man was a capital offense. Tibeats left the scene in a murderous rage, returning shortly after with 2 men and a length of rope. What followed was a slow-motion nightmare that redefined the concept of endurance. Tibeats and his accomplices tied Solomon's hands behind his back and looped a noose around his neck, throwing the other end over a high branch of a giant peach tree. They pulled until Solomon was forced onto his tiptoes, his life literally hanging by a thread. But before they could finish the act, Ford's overseer intervened, not out of mercy, but out of a legalistic duty to protect Ford's remaining financial interest in Solomon. The men left, but they left Solomon hanging there. For hours, under a blistering Louisiana sun, Solomon stood on his tiptoes in the dirt, the rope tightening every time his muscles spasmed with exhaustion. He watched the other slaves go about their work, too terrified to help him, their eyes averted as he danced with death in the dust. If you found yourself in a situation where helping a friend could mean your own certain death, would you take the risk, or would you keep your head down to survive? This is the impossible choice Solomon's companions faced every day. Eventually, Solomon was cut down, but his safety was non-existent. He was sold again, this time to the man who would become his tormentor for the next decade, Edwin Epps. Epps was a notcher breaker, a man who prided himself on his ability to crush the spirit of any slave through a combination of relentless labor and calculated psychological warfare. His plantation was a factory of misery centered around the white gold, cotton. The rules at Epps's were simple and savage. Every slave had a daily quota. At the end of the day, the cotton was weighed. If you were even a pound short, the whip was the only response. Solomon, despite his physical strength, was not a natural cotton picker. His hands, used to the precision of a violin bow, struggled with the sharp, prickly husks of the cotton bolls. He lived in a state of constant, low-level terror, knowing that every sunset brought the sound of the lash echoing across the quarters. Epps was not just a brute. He was a man possessed by dark, volatile impulses. He had a twisted obsession with an enslaved woman named Patsy, a queen of the field, who could pick 500 pounds of cotton a day. Epps's lust for Patsy was matched only by the vitriolic jealousy of his wife, Mary Epps. Patsy became the lightning rod for the dysfunction of the entire household. She was whipped by Epps for refusing him and whipped by Mary Epps for existing. Solomon watched this tragedy unfold daily, a witness to a level of cruelty that seemed to defy human logic. He saw Patsy, once a vibrant and proud woman, slowly being carved away by the relentless demands of her masters. It was a stark reminder that in this labyrinth, beauty and talent were not shields, they were targets. Solomon realized that to stay Platt, he had to become invisible, a shadow among shadows, while his true self retreated further into the hidden corners of his mind. Years turned into a blur of seasons, the planting in the spring, the hoeing in the sweltering summer, and the grueling harvest of the autumn. Solomon's life was measured in pounds of cotton and strokes of the lash. He became an expert at playing the fool, masking his literacy and his past with a performance of docility that satisfied Epps's ego. He played the violin for Epps's dances, grotesque displays where the exhausted slaves were forced to jump and caper for the master's amusement. As he pulled the bow across the strings, Solomon felt the bitter irony of his situation. The very instrument that had once been his ticket to high society was now a tool used to entertain his jailer. Yet in those melodies, he found a way to communicate. The music was the only language he had left that hadn't been corrupted by the system, a secret code of resilience that he shared with his fellow captives under the cover of the Louisiana night. The isolation of Bayou Boeuf was a psychological prison as much as a physical one. There were no newspapers, no news from the north, and no way to send a message across the thousands of miles of hostile territory that lay between Solomon and Saratoga Springs. He had tried once to bribe a white man to mail a letter, only to be betrayed and nearly killed. He learned the hard way that in the South, skin color was a more powerful bond than any sense of individual morality. He was a man buried alive, watching the years of his prime vanish into the dirt of a cotton field. He thought of his children. Would they even recognize him? Was Anne still waiting, or had she long ago accepted that the earth had swallowed him? These questions were the true torture, a mental whip that cut deeper than any leather. But just as the last flickers of hope began to dim, a stranger arrived on the plantation, a man who didn't belong in the world of Edwin Epps. The arrival of Samuel Bass on the Epps plantation in the summer of 1852 was like a gust of cold northern air cutting through the stagnant, humid heat of the Louisiana lowlands. Bass was a wandering carpenter, a native of Canada, whose lean frame and weathered face bore the marks of a man who had seen much of the world and liked very little of how it was managed. He was a craftsman of high repute, which was the only reason a man as volatile as Edwin Epps tolerated him. Bass possessed a dangerous trait in the antebellum South. He had a mouth that refused to be muzzled. He was an outspoken critic of the peculiar institution, often engaging Epps in heated theological and philosophical debates while he planned wood or framed timber. Solomon, working nearby as Bass's assistant, listened with a racing heart as the carpenter dismantled Epps's justifications for slavery with the precision of a master builder. To Epps, Bass was an eccentric Yankee crank. To Solomon, he was a potential lifeline. For the first time in over a decade, Solomon saw a white man who looked at the system not as a divine right, but as a moral catastrophe. The decision to trust Bass was the most terrifying gamble of Solomon's life. For 10 years, he had lived behind a mask of illiterate docility, knowing that a single slip, a displayed knowledge of letters or a hint of his true origin, would likely result in his immediate sale to the even more brutal sugar plantations or a shallow grave in the swamp. He spent weeks observing Bass, measuring the man's character in the way he spoke to the enslaved and the consistency of his defiance toward Epps. One evening, under the cloak of a moonless night, Solomon approached Bass in the temporary workshop. The air was thick with the scent of pine shavings and the distant, rhythmic chirping of cicadas. With a voice that trembled from years of disuse, Solomon discarded the persona of Platt. He revealed that he was a free man, a husband, and a father from New York, kidnapped and erased. He spoke of Saratoga Springs, of the violin, and of the legal papers that had been stolen from him. Bass listened in a stunned, heavy silence, the gravity of the revelation hanging between them like a physical weight. This moment represents the ultimate test of human intuition. Solomon was placing his life entirely in the hands of a man he had known for only a few weeks. If Bass was a charlatan, or if his abolitionist talk was merely a hollow intellectual exercise, Solomon would be dead by dawn. This brings us to a question that forces us to look at our own lives. Have you ever had to trust a complete stranger with something so important that betrayal would mean your total ruin? How did you know they were the right person to trust? Share your stories of intuition and risk in the comments. For Solomon, it wasn't just intuition, it was the desperation of a man who realized that if he didn't take this chance, he would die a piece of property. Bass did not report him. Instead, he sat Solomon down and asked for names, dates, and locations. He realized that for Solomon to be rescued, the erasure had to be reversed through the very thing the South feared most, the written word. The logistics of their conspiracy were as intricate as any espionage operation. Bass agreed to write letters to Solomon's friends and legal contacts in the North, but mailing them was a feat of high-stakes maneuvering. They couldn't use the local post office in Bayou Boeuf, where the postmaster was a friend of Epps and would surely notice a laborer's assistant sending correspondence to New York. Bass had to travel to Marksville, a town several miles away, to mail the letters under his own name. Solomon provided the names of Cephas Parker and William Perry, men of standing in Saratoga who could verify his identity. As Bass drafted the letters, Solomon felt a strange, ghostly sensation, the feeling of his true name, Solomon Northup, being committed to paper for the first time in 12 years. It was as if he were being summoned back into the world of the living, but the danger was far from over. If a single letter was intercepted, or if the recipients had moved or passed away, the trail would go cold, and Epps would surely find out who had instigated the inquiry. Once the letters were cast into the mail, a period of agonizing silent waiting began. Bass eventually finished his contract with Epps and prepared to leave the plantation. His departure was a crushing blow to Solomon, who felt the walls of his prison closing in once more. Bass promised to continue the effort from afar, but as the weeks turned into months, silence was the only response from the north. Solomon returned to the cotton fields, his body performing the familiar, soul-crushing labor while his mind was hundreds of miles away. Every time a stranger rode up to the Epps house, Solomon's heart would leap into his throat, only to be met with the crushing disappointment of a local planter or a merchant. The psychological toll was almost worse than the physical labor. Hope is a dangerous thing for a prisoner, as it makes the shackles feel heavier and the whip sting sharper. He began to fear that his letters had been dismissed as a prank or that his family had long ago moved on, believing him to be a ghost of the past. Unknown to Solomon, the letters had not only arrived, they had ignited a legal firestorm in New York. One reached Cephas Parker, who immediately recognized the magnitude of the crime. He contacted Henry Northup, a lawyer whose family had once owned and then freed Solomon's father. Henry Northup was a man of formidable legal skill and deep moral conviction. He didn't just see a case, he saw a moral obligation to a man whose family had been part of his own history. He petitioned the governor of New York, invoking a law that allowed the state to intervene when its free citizens were illegally enslaved. Armed with affidavits, property records, and the power of the governor's office, Henry Northup began a journey south that was part legal mission and part rescue operation. He traveled into the heart of Louisiana, a land where his presence was viewed with the deepest suspicion, navigating a legal system designed to protect property, not people. The climax of this period came on a day in early January 1853. Solomon was working in the yard when a carriage pulled up, a rare sight on the isolated Epps plantation. Out stepped a man whose face Solomon didn't immediately recognize, but whose bearing suggested authority and the North. He was accompanied by a local sheriff. Epps was summoned, and a tense confrontation ensued. The stranger didn't ask for Platt. He asked for Solomon Northup. The mention of that name, spoken aloud by a white man of authority, was the sound of the chains finally snapping. Epps was livid, threatening violence and legal retaliation, but Henry Northup was prepared. He produced the governor's documents and a mountain of evidence that the local sheriff could not ignore. The secret architect of the escape, Samuel Bass, had laid the foundation, and now the legal machinery of the North had arrived to tear down the walls. Solomon stood between his past and his future, realizing that the 12-year-long night was finally coming to an end. The confrontation on the Epps plantation was not a quiet affair. It was a collision of two irreconcilable worlds. Edwin Epps stood his ground with the snarling ferocity of a man who believed his legal property was being stolen by a foreign power. He paced the yard, cursing the Yankee interference and threatening to turn his hounds on anyone who stepped closer to his fields. But Henry Northup remained a pillar of icy legal resolve. He wasn't there to argue the morality of the institution. He was there to enforce a mandate from the governor of New York. The local sheriff, caught between his loyalty to his neighbor and the undeniable weight of the official seals on Henry's papers, knew the game was up. Solomon watched this from a distance, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was still in his work clothes, his hands stained with the dust of the fields and the sap of the pines, looking every bit the slave Epps claimed he was. But as Henry Northup turned toward him, ignoring Epps's rants, the world seemed to tilt. For 12 years, Solomon had been a ghost in his own body, a man without a name. Now, the man who knew his father's name and his children's faces was calling him back into the light. The resurrection didn't begin with a miracle. It began with a signature and the courage to look his master in the eye and reclaim his soul. Before they could leave the parish, there was one final hurdle, the court in Marksville. Epps had hired a lawyer to contest the release, arguing that the property had been purchased in good faith and that the northern documents were fraudulent. The courtroom was a tinderbox of local resentment. To the white citizens of Marksville, this wasn't just about one man. It was an assault on the very foundation of their social and economic order. Solomon stood before Judge Robert Watson, a man who had spent his entire career upholding the statutes of a slave state. Henry Northup presented his case with surgical precision. The affidavits from New York, the testimony of Samuel Bass, and the physical evidence of Solomon's true identity. But the most profound moment came when a violin was produced as a piece of evidence. Solomon took the instrument, and as he drew the bow across the strings, the music did what words could not. He played the sophisticated, intricate melodies of the North, pieces that required a level of training no field hand could ever have acquired in the cabin of a plantation. It was a language of freedom that the court could not refute. When the judge finally spoke, declaring that the man known as Platt was indeed a free citizen of New York, the room went silent. The legal erasure had been reversed. Solomon Northup was legally reborn. The journey back to New York was a surreal blur of movement and rising emotion. As the carriage pulled away from the Epps plantation for the last time, Solomon didn't look back at the fields or the cabins where he had suffered. He looked ahead, toward the North Star that had been his only silent confidant for a decade of darkness. Traveling with Henry Northup was a masterclass in the complexity of American life. They moved through New Orleans, up the Mississippi and through the border states, everywhere seeing the same chains and pens Solomon had barely escaped. Every mile felt like a victory over the laws of probability. He was no longer a piece of cargo. He was a man with a ticket, a seat, and a name. He spent the nights talking to Henry, pouring out the stories of the men and women he had left behind, especially Patsy, whose image remained a jagged piece of glass in his memory. He realized that while he was returning to the world, he was carrying the weight of 1,000 secrets that the world desperately needed to hear. The landscape changed from the mossy swamps of Louisiana to the rolling, snow-covered hills of New York, the air turning crisp and cold, signaling a homecoming that felt both like a dream and an impossible reality. Entering Saratoga Springs on that freezing January day in 1853 was a moment that defied simple description. Solomon walked up to the door of his family's home, his hands trembling as he reached for the latch he hadn't touched in over a decade. When the door opened, the 12 years of silence were shattered in an instant. Anne, his wife, had never stopped waiting, never stopped believing that the man who walked out for a circus job in 1841 was still alive somewhere. His children were no longer children. His daughters were grown women with families of their own, and his son, Alonzo, was a man who bore a striking resemblance to the father he barely remembered. The reunion was a chaotic mixture of joy and profound grief for the time that had been stolen. Solomon had missed the weddings, the births, and the quiet daily rhythms of a father's life. He had returned, but he was a man shaped by the whip and the cotton field, his body scarred and his mind a repository of horrors. Yet, as he held his grandchildren, he realized that his survival was the ultimate defiance against the system that had tried to erase him. He was no longer a footnote in a slave trader's ledger. He was the head of a family once more. But Solomon Northup was not content to simply fade into a quiet retirement. He wanted justice, not just for himself, but for every man and woman still trapped in the labyrinth of the Deep South. Within months of his return, he collaborated with local author David Wilson to publish 12 Years a Slave. The book was a sensation, selling 30,000 copies and providing the North with a visceral, unvarnished look at the domestic slave trade. Armed with his newfound fame and the support of the abolitionist movement, Solomon traveled to Washington, D.C. to bring charges against James Birch, the man who had first chained him in the shadow of the Capitol. The trial was a farce of American jurisprudence. Because of the laws in the District of Columbia, Solomon, the victim, was barred from testifying against his white attacker because of the color of his skin. Birch was acquitted, and the men who had kidnapped him, Brown and Hamilton, remained ghosts, their true identities never discovered. It was a bitter reminder that even for a free man, the system was rigged to protect the architects of cruelty. If you knew that seeking justice would likely fail and might even put you in further danger, would you still fight the battle just to make the truth public, or would you choose peace and silence? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. The final chapter of Solomon Northup's life remains one of history's most haunting enigmas. After the publication of his book and a period of lecturing on the abolitionist circuit, he slowly began to drift away from the public eye. By 1857, the records of his life become sparse, then disappear entirely. There are no death certificates, no confirmed burial sites, and no final letters. Some historians believe he was kidnapped a second time, a target of revenge for the damage his book had done to the slave trade's reputation. Others suggest he may have died in poverty or joined the Underground Railroad, helping others find the freedom he had fought so hard to reclaim. His disappearance is a final poetic echo of the erasure he faced in 1841. He came from the shadows, he spoke his truth to the world, and then he returned to the shadows. But while the man vanished, his legacy did not. His story survived the Civil War and the centuries that followed, serving as a permanent witness to the resilience of the human spirit. Solomon Northup proved that while you can chain a man's body and steal his name, the truth is a melody that can never be fully silenced. Solomon's journey is a testament to the power of memory and the importance of a single voice crying out against a sea of indifference. He defied every law of probability to return from a place where hope usually goes to die. His escape wasn't just a physical act, it was a victory of the mind over a system designed to crush it. Today, we remember him not as Platt, the property of Edwin Epps, but as Solomon Northup, the man who refused to be forgotten. As we close this chapter of one of history's most incredible mysteries, I have one final question for you. Which part of Solomon's journey do you think was the most impossible? His mental endurance during the 11 years of silence, or the sequence of coincidences that led to his rescue? We read every comment, so let us know your perspective. If this story moved you or made you think differently about the resilience of the human heart, make sure to like the video and share it with someone who loves history. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that history tried to hide. Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know.